Okay, thank you very much everybody for joining us today. We're very excited to continue our online discussion series for the second language writing interest section. Today we are very happy to have with us Dr. Betsy Gilliland, who is an assistant professor of second language studies at the University of Hawaii, where she does research on second language writing, particularly transition from high school, for high school students, multilingual high school students, from high school writing to post-secondary writing. And she also works in teacher education and teacher education with graduate students and conducting action research in particular. And so that's what she's going to be talking about with us today. So I guess over to you, Betsy.
Thanks so much, Ryan. I'm really happy to get a chance to share some more ideas about action research with the second language writing intersection group, because this is one of my first loves, but also a refound interest, because as Ryan said, my previous research, my dissertation research, has been with adolescent literacy, but since coming to Hawaii, I've also had the chance to take groups of graduate students to Thailand to do a teaching practicum. And one of the things that we've done is also conducted action research. So I was able to design a graduate class where my students who were teaching in the practicum had a chance to do their own action research on their teaching. And I realized just how powerful action research can be for teachers, and helping you learn about how to be a researcher in your own classroom, which I think is not something we always understand from the traditional paradigms of research. So today my plan is to talk for about 20 minutes, and hopefully at that point I will then turn it over to you and we can have a nice discussion. So some Q&A, but as much I would love for this to be a discussion among teachers and researchers about what we can do in our own work. So just a little overview of what is action research. Action research is basically two things, just what its name implies. So first is action, what you do in your teaching. And it also includes really thinking carefully about whether your perceptions of the situation are accurate, whether you need to revise how you understand where you are in your classroom, and based on what you're learning through your research. You take action in your teaching based on what's going on in your class, what your goals for the class are, why you're teaching that class, your reasons for being a writing teacher overall, for being in the location where you are. And really the action part is what we hope teachers do all the time, really thinking about what you're doing. Now the other half, though, is research, how you come to know what you're doing. And this is where action research diverges from just everyday reflective teaching. The research parts, as one of the big names in action research, Jean McNiff, says, it is not enough to offer descriptions of activities. You also need to give explanation for activities, that is, to say why you are doing it and what you hope to achieve. So in research, as in all forms of research, you gather data and you generate evidence from the data. But what really makes the difference with action research in the classroom is that you're also an active part of this process. You're not an outsider. So you're reflecting on the action and what you can see through the data. And where the title of my session comes from, you're actually making claims to knowledge based on the evidence you've gathered. So you are creating the theory. So where this goes against traditional views of research is the idea that instead of being this impartial, unbiased, objective researcher who does not have an investment in the situation, Action research is the opposite. So some scholars say that traditional research is acting on and studying others. So you are not a part of the process. As a traditional researcher, you're actually developing theory that you want to tell teachers about so that they can act. Action research is basically the opposite. You're acting with your students, you're studying yourself as a teacher, you're being reflexive, which really means you're thinking about who you are. And you develop interventions based on what you know about your class. And so I've heard students say, oh, it's bad. I've actually gotten reviewers say this too, that as if you're doing action research, you're inherently biased. And that is true. You are biased, but the biases are a core part of action research. They're how you know what's going on. So what's important is really knowing yourself, knowing what your biases are, because that's who you are and what you do in your practice. And the key with action research is that rather than taking theory somebody else developed and trying to apply it in your teaching, you're using what you learned from your teaching to create theory. My guess is many of you have seen an action research cycle, something like this. This is a very blunt cycle. It's a circle. The idea is you develop some sort of plan, you act on it, you try something in your classroom, you observe or collect other forms of data, you reflect on what you're seeing, and then you revise your teaching based on what you learn from analyzing the data. Now, if you've ever done action research, you probably know this is not quite as nice as it might seem. It's never quite as perfect. Sometimes you plan something, you try it, and you realize in trying it that it's not working. And so you may skip some of these steps. You may not even bother collecting data about it because you know it's just not working. You may realize that you need to try the same thing again but with different directions. You may realize you just need to scrap the entire thing. So the cycle isn't perfect, but it is, the idea of it being cyclical is important. You keep coming back to the practice. It's not a one-time thing. And the other part is the revision. This isn't a neat, tidy experimental study where you repeat the exact same process every time. Most likely you're going to be changing. So revision before doing it again is important. So let's say you have decided that you want to do action research. Just like in any other study, you need to start by thinking about the questions. What is it that you want to study? And Donald Freeman has this distinction between teaching versus researchable questions. And so, as he says here, teaching questions focus on the teacher, on what he or she does and how he or she does it. And so we ask ourselves teaching questions all the time. I have this problem in my classroom, what am I going to do about it? Or maybe a question like, what kinds of pre-writing activities do my students like? You have something you want to do and you investigate how to do that particular thing. Researchable questions are the ones that can go farther. Researchable questions, as Freeman says, are open-ended. They're usually focused on others, on students, for instance, and not on the questioner. And so rather than thinking about this particular incident alone, you're thinking about how does what I'm doing relate to teaching and learning more generally. So an example might be, what's the impact of providing audio comments rather than written comments on students' texts? So you're thinking about, at this moment, I'm trying to respond to my students' writing, but I also want to know, is this something that can be tried in other classrooms? So either kind of question works for action research, but if you're thinking about sharing your research beyond your specific classroom at this moment in time, researchable, you want to be thinking about how do I make this a researchable question rather than just a teaching question. The other distinction that Freeman makes is between first and second order questions. First order questions are observable things. If you've ever taken a qualitative research class, they're the etic questions, the things that anybody can look at the situation and observe it or count it or measure it or document it. And these are important because they let us know what's going on. What do you see in the student work? But we also want to be thinking about second order questions, how people perceive what they're doing, what's going on. So these are the ones that are the emic concepts, how your students are experiencing things. And this you can't immediately observe. You need to ask them. You need to have them write or speak about what's going on. And we really need both, because in a classroom we can see where people sit when they talk, what language structures they're using, but we also need to know why they're doing it, whether they're sitting with their friends for entertainment, or they're sitting by the window because they can't see well, whether they think the content is boring or it's too difficult for them. There's a lot of different reasons why students might do what they do, and so we need this kind of question as well. All right, so you've come up with some questions, and now you need to think about your study design. Number one, you want to think about what interventions you'll need. So what are you going to try out in your classroom? You also need to think about what forms of data you'll need to answer the questions that you have. And data is, the word data, sometimes we think of it as just measurable, calculatable statistics kind of things. But data are also many other things, student work, observations, video of your class. So lots of different ways that you can document what you're seeing. You also want to be thinking about where your data is coming from. Who's going to give it to you? Are you going to be doing observations? Is somebody else observing you and giving you some sort of feedback on what you're doing? Are you talking to your students? Are you talking to your students' parents? Are you talking to other teachers about your class? There's a lot of different people who can provide data. You want to think about how you're going to collect it. If one of the important things is knowing what's going on in the classroom, you could observe and try to take notes while you're teaching. You could audio record so you at least get the sounds of what the things that people say. You could video record. You could also have somebody else do an observation and give you notes about what they saw. You want to think about how often you need to collect it. So you may have something in mind that you really only want to collect data on at the times when you're doing a particular focus. You have a multi-skills class and you're only interested in the writing part, so you're only going to collect the data while you're teaching writing. Or you want to see something that changes day by day, which means you might need to collect data daily. And then this one, if you have had to write up anything about research, operationalizing your terms is really important. And this big word really just means defining it clearly so that other people know what you're talking about. So a word that different people have different interpretations of, you need to make it very clear what the meaning you understand is. So I really like this definition of intervention. A new approach to some aspect of instruction, adaptations of curriculum or strategies, documented as effective in at least some settings, integration of effective strategies in new ways with different types of students, or testing out a new idea informed by theories of learning and teaching. So sometimes we think of interventions as just this particular student has a problem and I need to do an intervention to solve that problem for that student. But if we think of intervention more as something we do in our teaching that's a change of some sort from what we've done before, then you open up a lot more room for action research. So you don't need to be doing an intervention that's very concretely designed to resolve a particular problem. It can be something that you're trying that you haven't done in this class before. It can be something that you've seen other people do. Or it can be adding a new spin to what you have, what you've done in the past. Once you know what you're going to do, that's the planning part, then you want to teach using your new idea and collect some forms of data. So the most obvious is student work. Action research in a classroom should be focused in some ways on our students. How are they learning? How are they experiencing what we're trying? And so in writing, we have all the writing that students do during class, the essays they write, other kinds of worksheets they do, exercises, all of those. But we can also observe what's going on. So as you're teaching, you might take some quick notes. One of my students this summer she printed out her lesson plan with a lot of white space around each one of the steps. And as she was teaching it, she would make little notes about what was going on. If you have students working in a workshop setting or in group work or something, you can step back a little bit more and take some more deeper notes on what you're seeing. You can also audio and video record your classroom. Audio is really useful if you have small group discussions and you can stick a recorder in the middle of the group and hear what are all the students talking about. Video recording for presentations is really interesting because you can see all the different multimodal resources the students draw on. And of course at this point it's also worth noting that you really want to take care of ethical issues. If you're just doing action research as a way of helping yourself understand your teaching, just being responsive to what's going on in your classroom may be enough. But if you want to share it outside of your classroom, you need to make sure that you're following whichever ethical procedures your institution has in place. If you're at a university, there's probably, at the US, it's usually governed by the Institutional Review Board, the IRB Human Studies approval process, where you need to describe the study you're going to do, explain how you're going to make sure that you're not unduly influencing students, which as a teacher can be difficult because you need to say, yes, I'm doing work, yes, I'm doing research, but I am not going to be treating my students differently depending on whether they agree to be in my study or not. Anytime you want to do anything with student work or recording of anything, you need to make sure you have consent from the students or if they're minors from their parents as well. Other forms of data you can collect are ones that may not be things you do specifically in your teaching, but you're collecting it for the sake of documenting what's going on in your research. Surveys can be really helpful. If you're doing a survey at the beginning of the year to find out who are your students, demographic information can be useful because you rarely get all the stuff you need to know about students from school records. Likert scale rankings, preferences, or challenges, you can ask students how much they agree with particular statements. Multiple choice can allow you to get a range of perspectives but still calculate it in more comparable ways. But sometimes you may want some open-ended questions on a survey since you might not be thinking about all the possible ways that a student will understand something. As you get into your research, it's also really valuable to hear your students' voices. And so if they're comfortable talking with you, doing interviews with them, if you speak their first language, you may want to do interviews in that language because generally students who are learners may not know quite how to express their perspectives in the new language. Some researchers have found focus groups actually are more useful because students can respond to each other. So rather than feeling the pressure of talking directly to you, you can pose a question to a group of students and they can talk with each other and generate more ideas than maybe one student on his or her own could come up with. You can also do tests to see, especially if what you want is to see did students learn a particular thing. If you have some kind of test that you give at the beginning before you try your intervention, and then you give the same test or a parallel test at the end, you can say, yes, they have learned how to do X, Y, and Z. And depending on what your goal is, you may want to have it be an essay test of some sort or some sort of language test. So tests can be quite helpful. So just to let you know, here's a plan for an imaginary study about vocabulary journals. And this is always a really helpful way of laying out your study before you do it, just to think through, am I planning to collect the appropriate forms of data to answer the questions that I want to know about. So thinking about in what ways they use journals, you might collect the actual journals they write, the essays they write, and do that on a regular basis, because you want to see over time how are they making use of this intervention. You may also want to observe what students are doing during class. If you've got vocabulary journals that you're hoping they'll use while they're writing, watch them write. Do they actually turn to the journals? How do they use the journals? And you may also be interested then in the specifics. What words do students choose for their journals? And so then you would want to do a more linguistic analysis. Look specifically at the journals to see which words they choose. Look at their essays to see what words they incorporate. Interview them to find out their reasons. So there's your second order question that's getting at the students' perspectives as well. Data analysis, some teachers I talk to, they're perfectly happy collecting data, but they don't know what to do with it once they've collected it. And this very short session is not enough, clearly, to teach anything about data analysis, but I do want to put a plug in for finding a mentor. If you've never done a particular kind of analysis, if you are working at a university, you may have a colleague who's got an expertise in statistics or in ethnography, and you can ask them for help. There's no reason that you have to do this all by yourself. Quantitative analysis can be really useful if what you want is to see overalls or to compare among groups within your class. And descriptive statistics can actually say quite a bit. So as anybody has taken high school math, you hopefully know a little bit about percentages and means or averages. And you can count errors, you can count how many students participate in things. And then you can also do qualitative analysis, really thinking about what are the themes, what are the ways that data fall together. Coding is often the process for identifying themes, trying to figure out what's going on in this set of data. You want to look across your data. Are the same themes occurring for different students? Are different themes happening in different groups of students? Do students do one thing in their writing and then say a different thing in interviews? And finally, and this I think is actually one of the most important parts of action research, is sharing it. It's all well and good to do your action research for the sake of improving your teaching, but if you've come up with something interesting, it's important to share it. And so first you have to figure out, when are you finished? One is when you're done. You've done the intervention, it's over, you've collected all the data you can. That would be a nice way to know you're done. But sometimes you realize this is a good practice. I'm going to keep doing it the way I'm doing it, repeating the same process again. You may find, on the other hand, that it's not working very well. And so you're just going to scrap what you were trying and try something different. Now, more realistically, it's quite possible you're going to run out of time. That happens a lot, especially on a semester system, or even more so on a quarter or an intensive English program where you only have 8 weeks. And then for many of us, becoming exhausted is actually why we stop. You've taken on new responsibilities, you realize you just don't have the energy to do it. So no shame in that at all. Don't don't do research and resent it. If you just don't have the energy for it, stop for the time, and you may want to come back to it. But you've done it, you've analyzed your data, you've found something, you can share it in many different venues. One is by presenting it with some of your colleagues. I would highly encourage starting a research group. If you and a couple colleagues are interested in doing action research, you can work together. If you've got something that might be of interest to your department or your program, do a small presentation within your department. You can share it at a local conference. You've always got the regional TESOL conferences where people would be interested. And if it's something that's relevant beyond your local region, TESOL is always a great place. I think the roundtables and poster sessions are often undersold at TESOL, and both of those are good opportunities for presenting smaller scale studies. So don't be shy about proposing something to TESOL. The other thing is to write it up. It actually is valuable to write about what you're doing, and you can always just write for yourself. Keep a blog, share it just with people you trust. But you may also, if you've got something that would be of interest to other teachers, your department may have a website where you can share something. Some departments have a blog that different people post to each month. Then there's always smaller scale publications like the Second Language Writing Interest Section newsletter or your local TESOL affiliates newsletter. And if you write it up in a more formal way, the TESOL Journal, Journal of Response to Writing, as a member of the board for that journal, I'd like to put a plug in for the Journal of Response to Writing as a place where you could write up teaching-related studies. Some journals do have have options that are not quite at the level of highly regulated research studies. They're interested in the teaching side as well, and so thinking about that too. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn it over to everybody else for some discussion. Here's a couple of questions that might be of interest, but feel free to pose any other questions you'd like. Thanks very much for listening. So Ryan, do you want to manage?
Yeah, thank you very much, Betsy. This was really, really, really interesting and thought-provoking. I don't know, do we want to start just with the first question?
Sure, yeah.
So challenges that you foresee in conducting action research in your own context. So anybody who's listening right now, feel free to jump in, unmute yourself, or make a comment in the chat box, and feel free to participate. This is interactive.
And just a reminder, anybody is able to unmute your own microphone. There's a little bar on the left that has an arrow, so you may need to open that thing out in order to make your microphone green.
So I'll be the brave first one to start then. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So hi, I'm Jennifer, and I'm teaching at Vantage College at University of British Columbia. And you mentioned earlier the issues around ethics and the like. And so without whinging about workload and the like, my question is about going through the different steps and processes of ethic boards and whatever else. And I liked how you talked about having a mentor, and because it can seem overwhelming to go through ethics and all the rest of it, I don't think that it needs to be, but I do think that pairing up with somebody else is a really, really valuable thing, and I think that mitigates a whole bunch of issues around that.
Yeah, it does. I actually, thinking about working with the Institutional Review Board, it was 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, when I took my first group of grad students to Thailand. Our IRB was very against the idea of teachers doing any kind of research in their own classrooms. They thought that was just undue influence, and there's no way it could be an ethical study. And my department chair, Graham Crooks, who's written a lot about action research in the past, as well as a professor from the College of Education and a professor from the College of Nursing, and I got together and decided that what the IRB needed, we talked with the IRB chair, and she said, we just don't know what action research is. We assume, based on medical research, that anytime you have a personal connection to the participants, you're going to be unduly influencing them. And so we came up with a guide for our IRB on what is action research, how can it be done ethically, how do we support students who want to do action research. And they were really responsive. They were very excited that we wanted to help them learn what it was. So I think that's another step, is if your institution is being unresponsive or putting up roadblocks where you don't think they should be. Sometimes it's just because their IRBs are trained in medical research and other kinds of scientific research on human subjects and don't quite understand how it works in teaching as well.
So I have a question and a comment for you. First of all, that guide that you prepared, have you published it, or is it available, or at least would you be willing to share it?
I personally would. I'm not sure about the rest of the committee, but yes, let me see, and we might be able to share it through TESOL or something.
Okay, and then my question is, what about the impact of, because we have to separate, I'm in a credit-bearing course, and so there's obviously a concern about influence in that regard. So what about postponing the coding and analysis of the data until the marking has been done and finalized? Would that be of impact?
Well, I think it depends on what your goal is. So it would be, yes, it would be fine if you kind of have an idea of what you want to be doing throughout the term. If, however, your goal in collecting data is to see how can you modify your teaching to help the students, then you would need to be doing some kind of analysis along the way. One of the things that we help the IRB understand, though, is that most of what you're doing in action research actually is relevant to your teaching. So if you're analyzing student work for the purpose of improving your teaching, that's still part of, oh shoot, I forgot the term. It's in the US IRB regulations. It's normal classroom practice or something along those lines, and as long as you can make it clear that what you're doing is not experimental and damaging to your students, then you may be allowed to, or it may be within the parameters of an ethical study to do analysis while you're teaching.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Good questions.
I noticed there are a few questions in the chat box here. One person asked, how do you recommend finding a mentor?
I think for me, I found, because I started, when I finished my master's, I started teaching at an intensive English program where our director was very supportive. She was really helpful. She saw that some of the teachers were doing interesting work, and so she at least gave us the encouragement. She's the one that got me interested in presenting at our local TESOL affiliate for the first time. So sometimes it can be a supervisor at your workplace. If you are still in touch with professors you were a student of when you were doing a degree in TESOL or education or something, you may be able to come back to them. It may also be colleagues. And it looks like Jennifer's also said on the topic of mentors, our local affiliate, DCTL, has set up a special interest group for those interested in research. And that's a great place, too. I know a lot of people who've found mentors through going to sessions at either local TESOL or international TESOL. And sometimes it takes, for that kind of thing, if it's somebody you've never met before, it takes just a little bit of guts to go up to a person and say, hi, I like what you're doing, can I stay in touch? But often people are really excited that you are interested in what they're doing. Sometimes they've been doing their work on their own and feeling like nobody else cares about it, and so having someone else who wants to collaborate is a good thing, even if you're on opposite sides of the continent.
And it also just made me think of this. TESOL, I mean, we have our interest sections. They can be really great resources too. So even just putting out a call to the second language writing IS, you know, a discussion board and things like that, looking for people that have experience in a certain area or would want to work on a project together, that could be a way to find somebody to work with also.
Yeah, Ryan, do you know with the new MyTESOL setup, is there ways of creating small groups within the interest section? So you're not necessarily having to keep emailing the entire list. You might be able to find a group and
if we could make like a second language writing action research group or for a certain project or something like that. That's a good question. I don't know if Michelle is still with us. But that's something that we can follow up on. I think that would really be a good way to do it.
Oh yeah, Nigel said yes.
Nigel said, yeah, it's supposed to be able to create subgroups. Good.
Right, let's see. Oh, Kendra has an interesting question here. If you work at an institution without an IRB, how would you go about getting the necessary ethical approval that peer-reviewed journals want to see before they consider publishing your work? That I don't completely know. Does anybody have experience doing that? If you're at an institution that doesn't have IRB. I think usually if you're at a public school, there are procedures for doing research, ways of getting parent consent. But if somebody else has experience with other systems, also I know in other countries things are different. When we were doing work in Thailand, the only requirement they had was for the university to say, yes, it's okay. We didn't have to go through any specific processes.
I know when I've done research in schools in other countries, I've gotten a letter from the school administration saying that they give me permission to do research there, and I still did the consent procedure and all of that, and that's been okay. But I don't know, in the U.S. I'm not really sure.
I think the minimum is making sure that your students consent, and if they're minors, that their parents consent, and that you have some way for students to opt out. So one of the things is when you're doing research on your own teaching, you don't want to be forcing students to share their work if they're not comfortable with it. So making it really clear, and that was something we had to help the IRB see, was how it would be possible to clarify to students that you wouldn't be penalizing students who don't agree. And Jennifer noted opting out of a recording is a trick. With video, often you can set it so that if you're video recording and students don't want to be in the video, they're on the sides of the camera so it's not visible. Audio, my dissertation research, I was using audio and I only had small groups of students, and so I had just recordings on the groups that had consented to be part of it. Let's see, we've got a couple of questions about journals as well. So if anybody has recommendations, that'd be great. Since I know the Journal of Response to Writing well, I can speak for that as saying, yes, there's definitely a potential for action research there, that if it's work that's related at all to response in any form, either traditional, teacher commentary on response or some group of peer response or any other permutations of response. There are sections about
and also a lot of the state TESOL publications, like the California TESOL Journal, or I know some of the other states have other publications. Those, I think, seem fairly receptive to action research. The second language writing interest section newsletter, or newsletters of other interest sections in TESOL, generally are pretty receptive of like action research, and even though like for the second language writing interest section it's a newsletter, but it does include research, reports of research also. Yeah, and TESOL Journal, I know Betsy recommended already, but that's also very practitioner oriented.
Could we maybe hear some examples of action research, or maybe even, you know, something that was published in a journal maybe about action research, an actual example?
Anybody have one that you've conducted? I have one of my students did, and he got published in the California TESOL Journal. There was a special issue about practicums last year, but he wrote about his experience doing action research on a practicum. He was investigating, so the student's name is Alex Kasula, if you want to look up his article, Kasula, in the 2015 California TESOL Journal. What he did was, there was one day in his classroom where he had been teaching with a PowerPoint as his kind of base for his lesson, and he goes in and for some reason or another he can't access the PowerPoint. And so at that moment he had to kind of ad-lib it and did a lot more work with the board. And what he realized was in some ways the students were a lot more engaged than he had noticed them being when he was using a PowerPoint. And so from there on he started experimenting by planning specific class sessions that were all using various things that he was doing on the whiteboard or the blackboard. I can't remember if it was chalk or not. I think it was whiteboard. And other sessions where he planned things using a PowerPoint as his base. And he documented, I think he was taking field notes, and he audio recorded some class sessions, and then he actually had his students write a couple of reflections about their preferences for his presentation media. And what he found was that for certain kinds of things he wanted to teach, the PowerPoint was better, and for other things the whiteboard was better. But it was very much a multi-cycle process. He tried something, he reflected on it, he looked at what the students thought about it, tried something, you know, worked some changes into his teaching. So that wasn't particularly writing related, that was more of a classroom participation focus, but it's one that he was able to get published as well.
Thanks.
Other examples?
There was a question, Jennifer had a question about consent and ethical considerations of having into L2 or L3. I don't know if that's something that you might have recommendations about.
Yeah, consent, it's tough if your students have limited English proficiency, because you want to make it clear that they do understand what they're consenting to. If all of your students speak the same L1 or only a couple of them, and you have somebody who can translate the consent form into their first language, that's always a desirable option. If not, it is possible to write the consent form at your student's language level. Generally, if you run it through a what do you call it? The online tool for measuring reading levels, and try to make sure that it's at or below where your student's average level is. Because I did a project last year where we kept modifying the sentences until we were able to get it down to a 6th grade reading level. So that's one option, or two options.
I noticed Nigel gave some examples of projects that his MAT-SOL students have done. Thank you very much, Nigel, for those examples. Really, really interesting. I noticed when I had a question about, you mentioned the choice board of assessments, and I don't know if you could maybe say what that is.
Oh, that was an MA student who was teaching German actually in a high school, and her students hated the class, so I didn't want to take it. And it was an idea. It was an interesting one because what I did, I had a question for you, Betsy, as well. Because of the limited duration of the practicum, because that's where I'm doing this, I have the students design an AR, an action research intervention, but they don't usually actually implement it because they're practicum students. It's not their own classroom. They're basically guests in a cooperating teacher's classroom, and they're not all able to implement their ideas. So I have them research it, figure out what they would do, and explain what they think they would find. This case was unusual. This was a student who was actually a full-time teacher, and so this was about giving students a choice of different assessments that would display the same learning outcomes. And she was able to implement it and report on the increase in motivation. It was a really nice little study. But I wonder if you or anyone else has some ideas about how to implement action research in a practicum setting, because I really want the practicum students to do action research, but there's so little time and they don't have the control to make changes in the classroom always.
Yes, it is. Interesting one for the practicum I've led. The students actually are the teacher of record. The university we go to sets it up so they have their own groups of students. And 2 years ago, we had 8 weeks in the classroom, and it was great that all the teachers were able to do at least 1.5 cycles, like try something out, analyze it, and then try something new, even if they didn't get all the way through to figuring out how to make more changes. This year, due to various scheduling issues, we ended up with only 5 weeks, and it really wasn't enough to do a full because with a practicum, the teachers are new to the setting anyway, and so for most of them, that was definitely not enough time to really try it out. I like the idea, though, of thinking about how you would set it up without doing it. And Jennifer also is commenting, what about comparing cooperating sponsored teacher observations and practicum teachers' reflections or priorities? So I think that's another option is, I'm trying to remember, I've worked with a few students, because when I was at UC Davis, the master's program, the students were supposed to be in their first year of teaching and doing action research, and some of them hadn't been able to find a job, and so they were trying to do action research as guests in other teachers' classes, and it definitely didn't work as well. So yeah, it's tough when they're not in their own classroom or there for a long time. Other ideas?
I'm drawing a blank. I'm just glad I don't have to do one right now. But I am sponsoring an MAT-SOL, sort of here we've called it an intern practicum, if you will. And she is observing me a lot and then doing her teaching. And she has regular reflections to write. And then what we're doing as an activity back and forth, and hers is just simply a pass-fail, so there certainly is an implication of me being the sponsor teacher of that power imbalance, but we have discussed it, is that we're emailing back and forth and almost this Socratic dialogue about her observations, her emotional responses to feedback and student uptake and all that sort of thing. So we're doing this throughout her practicum as a little project, just the two of us.
Yeah, one of the things that some of the teachers that have come with me on the practicum have realized is that especially the ones who are very new to teaching and have never had a class before, that their action research does turn a lot more into a investigation of their own beliefs and experiences as a teacher. So rather than, if I do this, how does it affect my students' learning? It's more, how does this work to help me understand my own preferences and strengths and weaknesses as a teacher? And it seems to be useful for them. So I think that could also be something that students on a practicum can do, is rather than trying to change how their host teacher is teaching the class, to see how does it work for them as a teacher to try the things that the host teacher either has to do or wants to do.
I had a question, Betsy. So the cycle, the process of doing action research, how does, I mean, understanding the existing research in a certain area, if you're interested in, say, different types of feedback or things like that, how does that fit into the process, and to what extent? How do you do that with students?
Good question. It's interesting because with the Thailand practicum, we have so little time that they kind of just jump into it. With students who have a whole semester, or if you're doing it in your own classroom where you know who your students are, or you at least know your context, I think the literature comes in first at the plan stage. So you start, once you've identified something that you want to know more about. So you write a question that involves something about your students' learning or a particular thing, then you would certainly go to the literature and see what have other people done. Because a lot of times with teaching, somebody's already thought about this in possibly a different context, but they have thought about it. And so you don't need to go to the effort of reinventing the wheel. So looking at the literature in the planning stage, that also, if you're familiar with the various theories related to explaining what's going on, that can help you figure out what to try. So then you would use literature to help you develop the actions you want to do. And then I would say go back to the literature at the stage of reflecting and revising. So as you are analyzing the initial data you've collected, then you want to go back and say, okay, this is what I saw, this is what happened in my class, why is that happening? And some people may have explained it, and it may be that the explanations in the literature are not helping you understand what's going on, and that can clue you into you're actually seeing something different going on. It's not necessarily the same phenomenon that other people had seen. So I think the literature, ideally the literature should come in multiple places and for different purposes.
And I guess the idea that it is cyclical, it's not just one time around this circle and you're done. The first time around the circle, it seems like it could take a bit longer because you have to familiarize yourself with the literature and those kinds of things. But then once you go around once, then you're revising your questions, changing things a bit to answer some similar but different questions, and then you can kind of go through it a little bit more quickly, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it can also help you with then coming back to the theory. So what can you then say about these phenomena that hasn't been said before? So how have other people explained it? How does what you saw in your teaching add to, contradict, build on what's already been seen? And so that's part of where you come up with your own theory as well. And Jennifer's also pointing out the keyword praxis is a really important one to think about too, that it's theory informs practice, practice informs theory, and it is an ongoing cycle.
Yeah, that idea of praxis, I mean, I'm just thinking about what I work with MA students, and they often come in with this idea of research as something that they just, they're consumers of it, they're observers of it, they're not doers of it. But really, as a teacher, you're constantly making hypotheses and answering those, by observing your students. So it really is a lot of research just in teaching.
The other challenge I have had with some MA students, and actually I had a conversation yesterday with a visiting doctoral student, is helping students who've been very trained in this idea of research as objectivist experimental work understand essentially how messy action research is. It's not this neat, you can have the entire experiment planned out, you have a control group, you try it, you measure things. It's very much back and forth. You plan stuff, but then you end up changing it sometimes as it's happening. Or once you've reflected on what happened, you change it and try it again. And you don't necessarily have a control group because you have to keep thinking of ethics as a teacher. You don't want to deny students instruction just because you're trying to see what happens if I don't do this thing with them. Sometimes you can do it, you can set it up where you have students in two groups. If you're teaching two sections of the same class, you can try something with one class and do what you normally would do with the other class. You can't ethically deny students instruction and say, like, just sit here and don't do anything. But you can say, I'm going to, I'm interested in how this new approach to providing response happens, so I'm going to do what I have usually done with one class, and then the other class I'm going to do audio feedback. One of the things I saw a bunch of sessions on at the symposium last week was people trying screen capture where they talk through their feedback, or various settings where you can add an audio recording of your voice talking about a particular thing. So as long as you're not denying students instruction, you can divide it up that way. But helping grad students understand that action research isn't going to be very experimental. And also, the other challenge I've had is for writing for reviewers, helping them understand why when the teacher is doing the research, it's not going to be unduly biased. I've actually gotten that feedback from reviewers.
Sorry, could you expand on that?
Oh, yeah, so it was a article that I was actually writing with a grad student who had been the teacher doing the research. And one of the reviewers came back and said, how is it possible that the teacher was also doing the interviews and analyzing them? Surely the students were only saying what they thought the teacher wanted to hear and not being honest, or something along those lines. That was an interesting one, because it opened my eyes to the fact that when you publish an action research study, you may actually have to be really upfront about what is action research and why is it that you're not violating norms of research when you're being the interviewer as well. And so one of the things we did in revising it was to make it explain how, as the interviewer, as the teacher, he had already built this rapport with the students, and so they trusted him, he trusted them. They were able to talk actually more openly than they would have if an outsider had come in to ask the same questions of the student. But we actually had to really work on our phrasing in order to be able to explain that in a way that satisfied the reviewer.
Is there any reference that you particularly recommend to refer to? Because reviewers like that too.
Yes, I made a list of some really good books about action research, and Ryan will email that out after the session.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. And yes, Nigel says it depends on the claims you want to make. That is very true. And yeah, generalizability was another one of the issues that the student I was talking to yesterday brought up, and she was concerned about sample size as well. And so that's also where you want to be very clear on what action research can do and what it can't do. And it can't provide you with large sample sizes. It can't provide you with any ability to claim generalizability. You're very context specific. But that's one of the beauties of it. You know that context so well that is a part of how you're doing the research.
I think we also need to not trying to keep jamming a round peg in a square hole or a square peg in a round hole. We're not doing large clinical trials here. This is not only inherently messy, but there's a whole constellation of factors that go into learning. And I think that even some hardcore quantitative scientists do acknowledge the role of outliers and phenomenology and that sort of thing. So I think that we, embrace that and say these are individuals and these are worth, digging into a little bit further. But no, it isn't a mass reproducible, generalizable study per se.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's not even the point of doing it. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut in here, but I think we are just about out of time.
Yes, really.
Thank you very much, Betsy, for joining us and for leading this discussion. It's really, really useful. And for all attendees, I will send you the list of references that Betsy mentioned and also the slides. And once the recording is posted online, we will send that out to the whole IS. So again, thank you very much for joining us, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm happy to talk to anybody more, so please feel free to email me. I am really interested. The more I do action research and help students, the more I'm excited about it too.
Thank you.